Mike Wilson here, the host of the Stutter with Confidence podcast, and I'm super happy here today to be joined by, as Peter Reitzes always called him when Bob joined the show on StutterTalk for episodes, Bob, the expert Quesal. Welcome, Bob.
I wish that. Thank you, Mike.
And for those, in case you've been sort of not, in case some viewers have not been as involved in the stuttering world over recent decades, Bob is a PhD in stuttering and spent his career at Western Illinois University. And he was involved in the teaching side of things, and the research side of things, as well as clinical therapy with folks who stutter. And he's been retired for a few years now, since 2014. But was there anything I missed there, Bob?
Not really, no. Other than I also worked at the University of North Dakota and State University of New York at Plattsburgh during my career as well. So, I wasn't at Western my entire career, but.
Gotcha. So just kind of diving right into it. Bob, are you like many of us who have some pretty challenging memories from childhood in terms of, sort of realizing that, well, and I didn't mention this, but you're also a person that stutters.
Right.
So do you have some of those rather challenging memories from childhood? And if so, can you maybe share one or two memories that sort of stick in your mind?
Yeah, certainly. I can share a lot more than one or two, but yeah, I've stuttered for most of my life. Again, a lot of my earliest memories are not really necessarily my memories per se. They come from stories I was told by my parents. I had rheumatic fever when I was about just shortly before I turned 4 years old. I was in the hospital for about 3 weeks, and according to my parents, again, this is what they told me when I was recovering from rheumatic fever. I had I was not nonverbal for some period of time, and then when I started talking again, I talked very, very rapidly, and that's when they first started to notice my stuttering. They tell me I should slow down, those sorts of things. Again, the extent to which their memories are really clear or not, I'm not sure either. I didn't ask them about that. I was probably in my 20s. It was part of my therapy that I'll talk a little bit about in more detail later. But my therapy at Indiana University, what I call my good therapy, I had was asked to talk to my parents about my early stuttering, and they told me some of these things. And I remember as a kid, my parents would tell me things like, slow down and that sort of stuff. And I remember my mom telling me that my doctor told her that I would outgrow stuttering. And so when I was growing up, I always felt like, well, some morning I would just sort of wake up and I would not stutter. And that was kind of what I thought for quite a while. When I was, I had some speech therapy when I was a kid. My stuttering never really bothered me that much when I was a kid. I was lucky in that I was never really teased about my stuttering. I felt like I could manage it, although I've talked to people since then, and most people were quite aware that I stuttered. They were probably a lot more aware of it than I was at that point when I was a kid. But I had speech therapy maybe second, third grade, something like that. And then when I was 13 years old, I moved from New York to Indiana. And when I moved to Indiana, the assistant principal at the junior high school I was attending called me into her office and said, "We want you to go to speech therapy with Mr. Jansen, who was the speech therapist at the school I went to." And I said, I had speech therapy. It really didn't help that much. She said, "Well, you'll like Mr. Jansen. He's a really nice guy, and he'll help you a lot." And I often tell the story that Mr. Jansen was a really nice guy. He wasn't one of the nicest people I ever met. He gave me a book on speed writing that I still have, as a matter of fact. But we didn't really do a whole lot about my speech. We would sit and talk, and I was very fluent in therapy, and so there wasn't a whole lot to do. But around that time, I was contacted by a fellow who was in the speech pathology program at Indiana University, and he needed participants for a study he was doing. And so he arranged for me to take part in the study. So he came to my house and he picked me up. Remember, he was driving a little Volkswagen Beetle. And so we drove over to the campus of IU, and he was the most severe stutterer I'd ever met in my life. I mean, he had very long blocks. He managed his stuttering very well, but he had pretty severe blocks. And I was probably 13 or 14 years old at this time. And I remember when I met him, was like, oh my God, maybe I'm not going to outgrow stuttering, you know? And so that was probably the first time I had the experience of like meeting a person who was a pretty severe stutterer, who was an adult. And so again, I took part in the study. I believe it was an operant study, because I'd sit there and I'd read, and if I stuttered, I'd hear the word wrong in the headphones. And I remember thinking, what's going on here? This is all very bizarre. And I don't ever remember reading the results of that study, but I haven't tried to find it, because I knew his name and I looked for a study that had been published, but I never could find it. But anyway, at that point, it was just kind of like sort of an eye-opening experience. And so I began to think when I was in junior high school that maybe I wasn't going to outgrow this stuttering. And then, so as I started to think about that, that's when I started to kind of become a lot more covert about my stuttering. As I started thinking about my future, what am I going to do with my future? What am I going to do, going to college, meeting new people, things like that. I started to notice that I became a lot less precise in my speech. I'd refer to things like, what do you call it? What's his name? I wouldn't refer to things directly. And so I really think that that's when I probably first started becoming aware at a certain level that what the problem was that I was avoiding, and I wasn't really aware of that. Like if somebody said to me avoidance or words like that I'm very aware of right now, 50 some years later, but at that time I was sort of aware at a certain level that, I kind of knew I was going to stutter. I was afraid I was going to stutter. I didn't want to stutter. So I would just try to find ways to talk around words and whatnot. And it really became pretty debilitating, because, you'd find yourself in situations where, people would ask you your name or your address or your phone number, something like that. And of course, as we all know, it's difficult to word substitute when you're asked your name. So anyway, I went to college. I started school at Indiana University. Went to school there for 2 years, and didn't get a lot out of it. I didn't do a lot of socializing, didn't interact with people a lot. I didn't do very well. And so I quit after my sophomore year. I went to work in a factory for about 4 or 6 months. Realized I didn't really want to work in a factory for the rest of my life. And so I had a friend who was going to school at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, and he needed a roommate for spring semester. So I took the money I had earned working in the factory and moved down to Dallas, and sort of spent the spring semester pondering my future. And I realized that my stuttering was really holding me back. And so I decided to go back to school and change my major to speech pathology, and also get therapy for my speech. And that's really when things turned around, was when I went to therapy, what I call my good therapy at IU, because at IU, we started to look at things like, I would say things like, well, I know I'm going to stutter. And they would say, well, how do you know you're going to stutter? It's like, well, I just know. It's like, well, how do you know? And I started to realize that what was holding me back was that it wasn't that I stuttered, it was that I thought I was going to stutter. And like, it's really not a failure if you don't give yourself a chance to fail. It's like, there's a difference between not trying and failing, you know, and I sort of couldn't see that distinction initially. And so a lot of what we did in therapy was not so much working on my speech per se, although we certainly did things that involved, you know, working on speaking techniques, but a lot of it was just like reframing how I thought about my stuttering, and thought about what would happen if I stuttered, and thought about what people would think of me if I stuttered. And so that's when I began getting interested in what I refer to in those days as attitudes. You know, my attitude about my stuttering was really what was the big driving force for me. It wasn't so much my speech per se, it was how I thought about my speech. And that sort of became the driving force for my whole career. Was it's not so much what you see on the surface. There's so much going on. Again, you talk about the iceberg. It's not what you see on the surface, but I was like sort of the duck, you know, paddling like mad underwater, you know, trying to make myself appear fluent, and exerting so much effort. And really, you know, if I just let myself talk, it would have been so much easier, you know. And so again, a lot of my memories are not really associated with like speech failure per se, although I do have certainly memories. One of the stories I used to tell a lot was I was in a Burger King, and I wanted to order two Whoppers, and I'm standing in line. It was a fairly long line. I'm sitting there and I'm going, oh, 2 Whoppers. And I started becoming very, very nervous. I'm not going to be able to do this. So I get up to the window and I ordered two fish sandwiches because I couldn't say Whopper, you know, or was convinced that I couldn't say Whopper, you know, those sorts of things. I remember when I was, I think, a senior in high school, I was in class answering a question, and I had a fairly severe block for me. And my classmates started laughing, and I thought, you know, gee, if these people have known me for years are laughing at me, what's going to happen when I go off to college if I stutter, you know, in front of people that don't know me? And so those kinds of experiences are the kind of things that really trigger the really pretty severe avoidance. And so I spent a lot of my time, you know, just working real hard to appear fluent, and you realize that's a very futile effort ultimately. But at the time, it seems like, well, that makes a lot of sense, you know. So,
and with that, well, this reminds me actually, right now, I know from what you said, you're not a huge fan of spending too much time on Facebook, but Scott Yaris's Stuttering Therapy Resources is doing a series right now of videos on their Facebook page where Scott and Nina Reeves, I think, and Chris Constantino so far have made videos, and they're talking about the focus on fluency.
Right.
And on even using the word fluency with folks that stutter. I watched Scott's video earlier today at the time we're recording this, and he said, look, I understand, you know, if you're coding it for billing purposes, you know, you have to use the word fluency. There's no avoiding it because that's what we're stuck with. But with, you know, with folks that stutter, and just in talking about it in general, this focus on fluency is sort of a constant, you know, setting. I don't think he uses these words, but it's almost like setting them up to fail, right? It's like, well, if you don't get to perfect fluency, well, then you're, you know, then we're failing here. We're failing. You're failing. Yeah. Well, and this kind of dovetails into another.
Well, let me just jump in real quickly, because I watched those videos as well, and I thought that the video that Chris Constantino did was outstanding. I mean, he did a great job of explaining why the issue is not fluency. The issue is really, I could forget the word he used, naturalness or something like that. The issue really is how much effort are you putting into talking, and oftentimes you put more effort into trying to be fluent and less effort into simply talking the way you would normally talk, which might involve some stuttered speech, but there's a lot less effort involved in that. And I think Chris did as good a job as anybody I've ever seen of explaining that in a very, very short time. And he did really an outstanding job. And And I think that, in fact, I was talking to Scott just the other night, and he was saying that they're in the process of trying to sort of get a more formal thing written, try to get something out in the literature where they talk about how, and again, I hope I'm not mischaracterizing this, but basically that the word fluency really is not doing us any favors, and we need to perhaps just call stuttering, which is what it is. It's stuttering therapy. It's not fluency therapy. We work with people who stutter. Stuttering is not a bad word. I think that people often mischaracterize what L. Johnson said about using the word stuttering. It's not a bad word. It's not calling somebody a bad thing if you say the person's a stutterer or a person who stutters. But for some reason, there's sort of this mythology has grown up that we can't use the word. It's this bad word. It's like, well, no, it's just a word, you know. And so, if the person stutters, then say they stutter. Don't try to, you know, make it something that it's not, you know. So anyway, but so yeah, that series that they're doing is really an excellent series. So.
And I think that that word that Chris said was spontaneity.
Spontaneity, that's it. Pardon
right?
me.
Right. And you know, to me, the point of talking, as far as I know, is to communicate. Right? That's the whole point. It's not a fluency contest.
Right.
And you know, I mean, you know, as we know, in the world of speakers, there's all sorts of different kinds of speakers. There's fast talkers, there's slow talkers, there's non-stuttering folks that have more stuttering in their speech. There's, you know, loud talkers, quiet talkers. It's all over the map, right?
Right.
And, you know, and I think for many of us, I don't know how you quantify the exact percentage, but of, you know, the hundreds of folks that I've spoken to that stutter, and certainly my experience, and it, you know, sounds like your experience from what you're explaining, when we get to a stage in our life when we're really focused on our fluency or lack thereof, it complicates our ability to communicate, right? Or it compromises our ability to communicate because, you know, and for me, it happened late in middle school where I was made fun of for the first time. This was in the 6th grade. I just had started liking girls, and I liked a girl, and another boy liked the same girl. And, you know, I don't even remember noticing my stutter before then. Apparently, from what my parents tell me, I had it, but I don't remember it ever being a problem at all. And I was, you know, sort of the class clown before that, you know, if anything, I was talking too much in class and in school. But, you know, I got to 6th grade, I got made fun of, it was being used against me. And this effort that me and the other boy, you know, were trying to make the girl like us. And from that point on, I started trying hard not to stutter. And I swear within 6 months or a year, I could barely get a word out.
Right.
And, you know, I think of that as when I went from my pre-iceberg self and just the iceberg, you know, deep and dark, formed fast. And from the 7th grade through the end of high school, my whole mission was to hide my stutter.
Right.
That was my whole mission in life. And you know, that was crippling. I couldn't be myself. I couldn't form hardly any real relationships with people because it was all about this obsession to hide my stutter.
Right.
And you know, all the speech therapists I had, like, you know, you mentioned the good therapy you had, you didn't specifically call the other therapy the bad therapy, but I suspect that's, you know, that perspective is probably there, or you know, the far less effective therapy. Right. You know, and the therapy I got as a kid, which was in the 80s, the only therapy I had that ever really helped me was the non-avoidance therapy. And when I was a freshman at Florida State, I don't know if you knew Dr. Richard Ham, who ran the program at Florida State for a number of years. And he was probably in his 80s already at that point when I was at Florida State in the mid 90s, but he took an interest in me Well, when my parents dropped me off at Florida State, they stopped by and spoke with him for like an hour and sort of begged and pleaded to, please help our son, because I didn't want to leave home.
Yeah.
I didn't want to leave home. I wanted to stay in the nest and keep talking to as few of human beings as I possibly could. And they're like, nope, you're going away to school. You got to leave the nest. And anyway, Dr. Ham really took an interest in me. And the whole first semester at Florida State, he didn't introduce, any technique. He, in combination with the grad assistants there, just brought me around campus at Florida State, made me ask random people questions and learn to look them in the eye when I stutter. Learn to face that thing that I was so terrified of. What are people gonna think?
Right.
When I start talking like this. And as it turns out, the vast majority of the world wasn't like, Kevin was in the 6th grade. Most people are cool, especially adults. They're not out there making fun of the person, in the wheelchair with a stutter or whatever. They're pretty cool.
Right.
And that was a revelation. I was like, wait a minute, you mean I can just say what I want and stutter, and the earth keeps spinning and the sun comes up tomorrow? Really? That was just a revelation, in my life.
Yep.
A revelation and a revolution, I guess. But all the other therapies I had growing up, which was, tens of thousands of dollars worth of therapy, was all focused on, well, Michael, you're having a tough time with those D words. Let's read some D words. Okay. Donut, dog, dinosaur, and it's like, well, I can say it all day long in therapy.
Right.
It's out in the world. That's where it matters,
Right.
And
Well, I think one of the things that's frustrating for people who stutter in therapy too is we do those things. I mean, I'm sure you had the experience, and I had it all the time. You're in therapy, you're doing all these activities, and you're fluent. I can do this. Again, all your D words. This is great. And you go out, and the first person you see, all that fluency in your therapy room is gone. It's like, well, what is this? And I think part of therapy should be explaining, we're going to do things here in therapy that will probably lead to, pretty good fluency, but that doesn't mean you're going to be able to do it outside. The outside world is different, and I don't think that SLPs necessarily prepare their clients for the reality that they're going to face when they're not in therapy, because therapy is a much different environment. Again, like I said, when I was in therapy in junior high, I could sit and talk to Mr. Jansen for an hour and stutter very, very little, and he was like, great, keep doing what you're doing. It's like, well, if I could spend my entire life in your office sitting here talking, I'd be fine, but that's not the way the world is. The world is not your office. I wish it was, but it's not, so anyway.
right. It's a very, very different, world, and, in the friendly confines of the therapy session with the super kind, nice therapist, your whole relationship with him or her kind of revolves around your stutter. There's nothing to hide.
Right.
They're not
stuttering, right.
Yeah, like, they're not going to judge you if you have a stuttering moment, that sort of thing,
Right.
But yeah. And so the analogy I like to use with this is with sports, because so long as the athlete is anticipating, the pain of making a mistake. In other words, so long as the athlete is playing scared, which is a sports term, it's going to be almost impossible for them to reach their physical potential. You gotta, in sports, I mean, if you're not, not necessarily okay with missing the shot, but it's a part of the game, right? And if every time we miss a shot, then we're like devastated, or we feel horrible about it, then it's very unlikely that we're going to find our stroke later in that game, that sort of thing. And I think this is, well, there have been a lot of athletes over history. I've known some of them who could hit shots all day long when it's only me and, them out there shooting. But if you put 1,000 people in the stands,
Right.
they couldn't hit, the broadside of a barn sort of
Right.
thing.
Right.
You're from Indiana, so you'll know that expression,
Yes.
that basketball expression.
Yes, indeed.
But well, and for me, it was key to first learn to face the full-on stutter, right? And to know that, look, a quote unquote worst case scenario here, I have a ton of blocks and a ton of struggle, but I know even that's not the end of the world. I can still finish my sentence. They'll still, 9 times out of 10 or whatever, totally understand what I'm saying. Actually, more than that.
Right.
And that it truly is okay. And that I don't have to walk around, worrying about the next stuttering instance. It's like, and in cases where someone's really confused, which occasionally happens, and we've all had the looks, so like,
Yeah.
what's going on? Or, like a nervous laugh or whatever, because people truly have no idea what's going on a lot of times at first. In fact, they probably think that we're a non-stuttering person having a stuttering moment, which is very different, right? Than when a person that stutters knows what they want to say, and they just can't get the word out of their mouth.
Right.
But once they do know, and those 4 words I've found to be very powerful, when you get that, occasional sort of disrespectful or just really confused reaction, I have a stutter.
Right.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Guy's got a stutter. Okay. Let's move on. People care so much more about their own problems than they do our problems, right? In my experience, they're not going to be thinking about my stutter the rest of their day, right? It's really not that important to them. Was that your experience also?
Yeah. And again, one of the things that I had to learn, and I think it's a difficult lesson, that usually people, when they do something like laugh or whatever, they're not doing it to be cruel. I mean, there are some people who truly are cruel, but generally the laugh is a nervous laugh. The look is a look of confusion. You get stuck when you're ordering food or whatever, and the person gives you the whatever. They're not doing that to be cruel. They're doing that because they truly are confused. And you think about people laugh nervously all the time about things that they don't understand. And I think that, we often take it as, well, they're laughing at my stutter, they're laughing at me. It's like, no, they're laughing because they're uncomfortable. It's not they're laughing at me, or they're giving me that look, just like I would give a look if somebody was doing something to me and they did something I didn't expect, be like, what is this? And I think once we kind of break that down, and I think one of the lessons I learned, I forget who I learned this from, but the idea that, it's important not to try to project your feelings onto listeners, because a lot of what we're feeling when we're talking, there's so much churning inside of us. In fact, one of the real good experiences I had in therapy, in fact, when I was at IU, was I was videotaped at one point, and I didn't want to be videotaped. It's like, oh no, I don't want to see myself talking. And I was amazed at how calm I looked. It was like, my gosh, this guy looks really like he's just talking. It's like he looks like a normal person just talking. And I couldn't believe that all the effort and energy and anxiety I felt inside of myself, particularly being videotaped, didn't show at all. And that was a very important moment for me. It's like, you know what? I'm feeling a lot more inside of myself than my listener is seeing. And so again, that makes you more confident then. Well, if maybe I can be, talking and feeling like I'm struggling, but my listener doesn't necessarily see that I'm struggling, because a lot of what's inside of me is not being shown on the surface, but these are things that it takes a long time. You don't just say this to somebody one time, well, everything's cool, cut the listener some slack, blah, blah, blah. These are, as Peter Reitzes used to talk about, these are seeds that are planted in therapy, and then they grow over time. And ultimately, you sort of have a mindset about stuttering that actually works. And you now can acknowledge your stuttering, you can accept your stuttering, you can deal with it in a holistic, sort of mature kind of a way. But you go through baby steps. I think that we haven't reached the point we've reached today just by having a therapist tell us a couple of things or have a couple of experiences. It's a bunch of experiences and a bunch of people telling us a bunch of things that we've kind of then filtered and synthesized into something that makes sense for us. And then we finally are at a point where we can cope with this thing. And that's why therapy is not something you do in a matter of a couple of weeks. It doesn't work that way. So.
And the mind requires proof, right? Just because somebody's telling us, oh no, people don't care, or you got to go out and experience it and know it, right?
Right. Yep.
In order to believe it.
Yeah.
So on this note of the good therapy that you had when you were at IU, which it sounds like was largely about helping to get you to a point where you were not avoiding as much, we're not beating yourself up as much when you weren't fluent, and sort of building up the courage. Also, that's something that Barry Guitar had spoken about, because he had gotten therapy from Charles Van Riper when he was young, and said, building up your bravery, he said, was one of the big things that Van Riper was trying to do with him. And they were doing a group therapy setting, I believe, at Western Michigan, I want to say. But the building up your bravery, was that a big part of the good therapy that you had?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of it was just sort of when I think about how I changed in therapy, because again, when I was in therapy at IU, I was in therapy for like 2.5 years, and I often say that I didn't need 2.5 years worth of therapy, but they needed a client who stuttered for 2.5 years at IU, and so I often would, it'd be like, you'd be a point where you think, well, I'm sure that I'm done. I'm sure I've had enough therapy now. And then in a semester, you'd have a conference. They, well, we want you to come back next semester, and then you realize, particularly after I got out and I started working for a living, and I was a clinical supervisor, you realize how hard it is to find clients who stutter. So if you have one that you sort of have as a captive audience like me, it's like, oh wait, we might as well have them come back. But the thing that was nice about that was I had a lot of different students who worked with me during that time, so we did a lot of different techniques. So they'd come in and be like, well, this semester we'll work on blah, 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 and they would try something different. So it was never like the exact same therapy. There was the same sort of underlying things that they would do, but the students would be able to try different techniques. And one of the things I found really, really interesting was that the semester that we worked really more on my speech rate, my speech phrasing, my sort of my delivery more so than my fluency. So they brought in some things where we work on things like phrasing. Do we just lock up there briefly? I can't hear you. Uh-oh.
For a second, I lost you, but I think you're back now.
Okay. Last
we heard you were talking about they started working with you on your phrasing and your delivery.
So we would do these activities. There was this old therapy book by Fairbanks, had all these different therapy things in it. And so the thing would be like, you would read passages and you would work on phrasing and where were right places to pause and things like that. And what was interesting was that semester where we didn't really work on my speech much at all. It was really more of a sort of Well, let's change that. We didn't work on my speech fluency at all. We really just worked on my speech delivery. I think I got as much benefit that semester as I got from any other semester that I was in therapy. But a lot of it was simply that we did things like how I thought about my speech. I took risks. We go out of the clinic room. We would, do activities outside. A lot of it was largely, they would ask me about my goals, what my goals in therapy were, those sorts of things. And it was just a much different approach. The supervisor at Indiana had studied under Wendell Johnson at Iowa. So I think she had very much of that Iowa approach. Sort of the Dean Williams, Wendell Johnson approach to treatment, which I came to learn a lot about when I went to Iowa later. But again, it was just a very helpful approach. It just really, and maybe the other thing I think at that point as well is I was ready for therapy at that point as well. And I think that's also a big thing. And I've often talked about that you get a client that comes in for therapy and they're not self-referred. That's often a challenge because if the client's not ready to change, we get clients when I was working at WIU, for example, and they'd be referred by a professor and they'd come to meet with you and they'd say, well, what about your speech? And they'd be like, well, I think everything's pretty cool. I manage my stuttering pretty well, And you would try to encourage them to, well, maybe we can do some things with your speech that might be helpful. But if they weren't willing to acknowledge that there was something they could do to speak differently or speak better, then they generally wouldn't have success. And I was ready at that point in my life, around age 20, to really do something about my speech because I did acknowledge that my speech was holding me back. And at that point too, I read the book, the Stuttering Foundation of America, back in those days, Speech Foundation of America, the book called To the Stutterer, which now is advice to those who stutter. But that was like, I think 24 or 28 chapters written by people who stutter. And again, that was very eye-opening for me as well. So a number of things happened there, my late teens, early 20s, where I was ready for change, ready to do things. But a lot of it was just kind of sort of unburdening myself and realizing that, the stuttering thing was something I could do something with, didn't have to hold me back. Again, even to this day, I don't like stuttering. I wouldn't choose that as one of my attributes. And you said, here's a list of attributes. You get to choose your top 10. I don't think stuttering would necessarily sneak in there. But I'm not one of those people that says, well, if I could take a pill and not stutter, I don't think it's my life I would necessarily do it. I think that I fit stuttering into my life, and that's kind of what I was starting to do back when I was 20 years old. You sort of begin to accept it as an attribute. It's part of who you are. Again, you wouldn't choose it necessarily. It's not my favorite thing about myself, but it's certainly not my least favorite thing about myself either. And so, it's just something, and again, that journey does not occur in just a couple of weeks or a couple of months or a couple of years. It takes a while to get here. So
the phrase I like to say is, stuttering's not ideal, but it is okay.
It's okay, right? It's okay, right?
Right.
Exactly,
And
right.
yeah, I mean, I don't know that there's anybody that, that would rather have 10-second more struggle blocks as opposed to a half second, that sort of thing. But
Right.
but it does also, we wouldn't be exactly who we are if we didn't have the stutter, and we don't know who we would be,
Exactly right. Yeah. Think of how many things about me that have occurred because of my stutter. So it's like, well, I would have missed out on all those opportunities. I might have ended up somewhere else as well. That's true. But one thing too that just came. You mentioned that the notion that. Remember that Dean Williams used to do this thing where he would ask people who stuttered, he would say to them, if I could guarantee you that the worst stutter you'd ever have would be like 2 repetitions. So it'd be like repeat. And that's the worst you'd ever stutter the rest of your life. Would you be in therapy? And they'd be like, no. Because the idea is not the stuttering per se. It's the loss of control. It's the feeling that I'm going to be in a block that's going to be so uncontrollable and so embarrassing and so debilitating that I'm going to find myself really embarrassed or really upset or whatever it might be. And again, it's the nature of stuttering, the fact that it's so unpredictable, it's so variable. You do have these moments where you're talking really, really great. And so all of a sudden you have this block and you're stuck and you feel embarrassed. And again, if I knew I was just going to stutter a little bit, and if I'd known that my whole life, sure, I'd have had no problem at all. But it's not the idea that you stutter, it's the idea that you don't know what the stuttering is going to be like. And it's this, you're constantly off balance because you have no idea when's the stuttering going to pop up, how severe is it going to be, can I manage it or not? Sometimes in spite of your best efforts, you have these blocks where you just can't do anything. And people don't understand that helpless feeling. And the feeling of loss of control, the social penalty that's associated with losing control. And that's what stuttering really is all about. It's not being disfluent. It's losing control. It's social penalty. It's not knowing. It's this, this uncertainty about speech. It's a lot more than just, if you talk slower, you'd be fluent. I wish it was that simple. It'd be great. So anyway,
right, the uncertainty. And my understanding is there's a lot of research, beyond stuttering in the broader world of human beings, that people generally don't like uncertainty. And, I've heard it, brought up in various contexts. One was with death, right? Most people feel like they need a belief system where they know exactly what's going to happen to them after death, because the uncertainty, is hard on people.
Yeah.
I think stuttering is very much can feel like that, right? You're like, okay, I'm giving a big presentation today, or I got a big, wedding toast. Is it going to be an easier day with my speech, or is it going to be in the middle, or is it going to be the opposite? I don't know, right? And that doesn't feel good. And the way I sort of dealt with that was to say in my mind, and now it's a lot easier since I found an approach in the last few years. But for the first 41 years of my life, which is when I did most of the things that I've done in my life, that's when I, became a dentist, got married, had 4 kids, grew my practices up to 5 locations and about 200 employees. That was all done with these, good stutter going on, or I'd call it a good stutter than a bad stutter. But the way I dealt with the uncertainty was to just say, look, I don't care if it takes me 10 million freaking years to get this word out. I'm going to say it.
Right.
And the listener can sit there and listen, and if they don't want to, no worries. But I'm here and I'm going to say it. And that way I just sort of like plan for the worst, right? Be prepared for the worst, hope for the best, sort of thing.
Right.
Because for me, being patient with myself and being forgiving of myself in those moments was key. Not to beat myself up, just because my stuttering was more challenging, because I didn't know how to control the damn thing. I had no idea. So it was like, I don't know when it's going to come out. If I knew, I'd spit it out, but I don't. So, it is what it is, Yeah. And so it was a game changer. For me, that eye contact training, and essentially deciding that I'm not running away from words anymore just because I might not be able to say it fast. And I'm going to say exactly what I want. And, and that probably led to me being more severe, because I wouldn't change words. Like, as a matter of principle, I was like, I'm going to say the exact phrase I want to say. And I thought of it in my mind that if anybody were transcribing this, I don't want an incoherent sentence, right? I want the sentence that I want to say, and I want the whole, again, what's the whole point of speaking? I think it's to communicate, it's to, it's sort of like, I heard the founder of TED, or the guy that runs it, Chris Anderson, say this when he was talking about the power of public speaking. He was like, it's like downloading what's in the speaker's mind into a bunch of others' minds, instantaneously, essentially, right? That's what human, speech and listening is. And it was just, it was so freeing. My stutter, you mentioned when you were at IU that you felt like after a little while that, like, okay, I've gotten as much therapy as I need. Like, I've gotten out of this what I need, but, like, they needed clients. They were trying to keep you in, which I can understand. In my case, I did stop going about halfway through the second semester, because in the second semester, after doing so much for me in the first semester from the avoidance, and the courage standpoint, they started introducing some speech techniques which just weren't working outside of the clinic. So I said, what's the point? I'd, rather spend this time, with my friends, hanging out in my life. So I stopped going to therapy at that point. I renewed it later. I did some various things. I tried the Speech Easy. There was a guy in Florida who believed in just reading for an hour a day. So I did that for 6 months, read out loud. That didn't help. I went to Hollins. I went to therapy at NYU and Syracuse University. And it just, once I had melted most of that below the iceberg, I felt like there just wasn't much left that speech therapy could do for me, because the techniques would always work with the therapist, easy onset, especially.
Right.
I could talk like this all day long, barely articulating my words, really gentle speaking. And first of all, I noticed, well, it didn't work outside of the clinic, but on the occasions when it would, like, let's say ordering a drink in a loud bar with easy onset, excuse me, can I have a Heineken, please? A what? A Heineken. A what? You just want to say Heineken, give me a damn Heineken. But so for me, the iceberg was largely melted, not largely, but, well, like 80% of it, I would say, was melted that freshman year of college. By the time I was accepted into dental school, I would say 99.9% of the below the surface of the, the water iceberg was melted, where I would raise my hand in class in front of 300 other people at NYU in my dental school class and ask my question. And there were maybe only 2 or 3 people that were willing to ask questions in front of all 300 of us, right? And here the stutterer is raising his hand and asking questions and stuttering away. And I would actually look around from person to person, like if I felt like somebody might be giving me, the look sort of thing, like, why this guy talking, that sort of thing. I'd look at them in the eye and just wipe the look off their expression, wipe the expression off their face. And the point was not to be like mad at them or mean or whatever, just to let them know that, this is a situation where you should be respectful. Not that I had to say it, just the eye contact would would make them be more respectful. And I felt like people actually, and Chris Constantino talks about this, stutter gain, I think, is the phrase that he uses. And look, I'm not, I don't think anybody would argue that there aren't, some practical difficulties sometimes with being a person that stutters when you're, trying to order your food or whatever, and there's 15 people in line behind you, that sort of thing. It's not as efficient, right? Sometimes, but you can have these real human moments with people where you're sort of putting your, you're not hiding your vulnerability. You're not hiding your problem. You're displaying, bravery, or displaying courage and the determination to be yourself. Like, look, what I have to say here is important enough that even if I stutter my way through it, I'm going to say it, right? That sort of thing. So it can actually show a level of confidence because you're not, hiding in the corner in the fetal position.
Right. Right.
Um, and I don't, this is obviously something that for a lot of people is sort of akin, it seems like sort of akin to childhood trauma. I mean, a lot of us have some really real, like the worst memories of my life.
For sure.
Right. Even though I've got some other things with, with people dying that were rough moments also, but the worst moments of my life were, that sort of situation where first day in 8th grade or whatever, and they're like, the teacher's like, okay, we're going to go around class and everybody, just like, oh my God, I just wanted the world, if I could have hit like an eject button, even if there's like a 90% chance you're going to break bones, but you won't be socially embarrassed today, I probably would have hit it at that stage of my life, And
no, I think most people, well, I believe that, when people have a lot of very deeply embedded memories of stuttering that they go back and they think about. In fact, even when I was thinking about, talking to you on this podcast, because again, we're gonna be talking about stuttering, so I start thinking more about stuttering and my stuttering, and all of a sudden you start going back and thinking about, I remember this episode, that episode, and that episode, and that episode, and there's dozens of them, and then you start thinking even more deeply. It's like, well, it becomes like not dozens, but maybe hundreds, and it's like, and some of them are little ones, like, well, it wasn't really a big deal, but you still can remember these times. And some of them are positive ones as well. You've got positive, but so many of memories are associated with your stuttering, whether it's times you were embarrassed, times you overcame your stuttering, successes, failures, whatever. It becomes a large part of your life and who you are, and it's difficult to sort of tease that out.
I hear you. I mean, it's deeply ingrained in us, and I think that's perhaps why it's so valuable to be with others that stutter, right? Just the presence, and I find it fascinating how powerful it is. I mean, I know so many people who in many cases went to, speech therapist after speech therapist over their life, but their life didn't start really changing for the better until they went to a support group and they started meeting other folks who stutter. And I wonder if that's maybe just meeting others that you like, and you're like, wait a second, people that stutter are totally likable. I like my stuttering friends just as much as my non-stuttering friends,
More, yeah. Right.
Right, even more, yeah. Well, because we get something, right? And you can step into a support group and having never met anybody there, but oftentimes very deep things about each other, right? You have this experience in common, and it's, I know every stuttering case and every person is unique and a little different, but there are also so many commonalities that are like what you were saying earlier in, this chat. I mean, almost all of us that have developmental stuttering have those same, almost, I don't want to say identical, but very similar experiences, right?
Well, and I said earlier, the reason I think that reading To the Stutterer for me was so powerful was here were 20 some people who had, and again, you read these stories and it's like, I've done that. I've done that. And it's like, then you don't feel so weird. It's like, oh, well, other people have done things I've done. Other people have the experiences I've had. And I think a lot of it is that because we do these things like, like ordering 2 fish sandwiches instead of 2 Whoppers. And at times it's so embarrassing and so shameful, you couldn't possibly tell anybody about it. And then you hear people tell similar stories, or you read about people having similar experiences doing the same thing, and you go, oh, that's not weird. That's not strange. And it makes you feel so much better because like, well, there are other people who understand why I did that or what I went through during that moment. And you feel a much more kindred spirit with those folks because they get you. You know, you try to explain to somebody who doesn't stutter. Well, why would you not just say two Whoppers? What's so hard about that? You know, whereas the people who stutter fully understand what you're talking about. I've had the same experience. I wanted to order X and I ended up ordering Y because I didn't think I could say X at that point in time, you know. And meeting other people who stutter is a very important, a very powerful thing. And it really does help a lot. It helps a lot.
And you realize that, no, my response, you know, and my story like that was, well, one of them was my senior year of high school when neither of my only two friends that I was comfortable speaking and stuttering in front of, neither of them were in my lunch period. So rather than find another table, I brought my lunch into the bathroom stall my entire senior year. I literally hid in the bathroom for the whole lunch hour, my whole senior year, just living in dread that somebody would discover this, you know, freak show, as I thought of myself, hiding from the world in the bathroom. And yeah, and you're right. It was so shameful. Like I'm such a pathetic person for doing this, you know. But we realized, no, actually, that sort of response, whether it's ordering something that you don't like to eat or hiding from everybody in the bathroom, is actually the normal response for a person that stutters, that doesn't know how to deal with it otherwise.
Right.
Yep. Very normal.
Yep.
And you know, most of these non-stuttering people walking around would have reacted the same way if they would have won the stuttering lottery, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Right. Yeah. Well, in fact, I used to make my students go out and stutter in public as part of my assignment. And the thing I used to always point out to them when they would talk about their experiences, they would say things like, "Well, I went to the store and I walked around for a while until I found somebody who looked like they would be somebody that that would be easy to talk to or something like that." And so I'd say, "Well, okay, so what exactly was it you were doing there?" It's like, "Well, I was just, you know, trying to find a," and it's like, "No, you were avoiding, because the point is you should have just gone to the store and the first person you saw, you should have gone up to them and stuttered. But instead you were choosing, you were trying to find a person that you could talk to who would make you less uncomfortable or whatever." And I say people who stutter don't have that choice, okay? Or they do choose to avoid speaking. So you're behaving just like a person who stutters. So why does the person who stutters does that, and that's considered strange, but you do it and it's considered fine for you, you know? And that was one of those moments for them to be like, "Oh my God, I never thought of it that way." It's like, well, see, that's the point of the exercise. I don't care whether you stutter in public and people acknowledge you or laugh at you or whatever it might be. The point is, I want you to understand how you approach speaking when you know you're going to stutter or you think you're going to stutter. Isn't it interesting how you do the same things that people who stutter do? But the difference between you and the person who stutters is you get to stop doing it as soon as you're done doing the assignment. The person who stutters has to do it for the rest of their life, you know. And I think that those are the kinds of things where people suddenly start to realize, oh, maybe this isn't quite as weird as it appears to be when I'm sitting here on the outside, just sort of as an observer, and I'm not sort of getting a little bit closer to the situation. So I always found that to be a very interesting experience.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I've heard from a few other professors, you know, that teach the, well, we can't get away from that word, but the fluency courses in the programs, right. Those that do assign a voluntary stuttering exercise, you know, for their students, and most of whom obviously are, you know, non-stuttering folks, that it's usually, if they're lucky, one person in the class actually does it.
Yeah, right. Yep.
Everybody else avoids doing that.
Right.
And they don't have the iceberg around stuttering. It's a brand new thing for them, but just the idea of going out and doing it, you know, and they're adults and they know why they're doing it. And,
Right.
you can understand somebody with all these painful memories from childhood and beyond that's hard for them to do. And,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, so, so we're talking about that. And I think that anybody in your classes that has gone out and done that, who has gone on to work with people that stutter, is probably 5 steps ahead of the game compared to a lot of their colleagues who have never experienced that or felt that possible shame of stuttering. Obviously it depends on the individual and
Right.
all
Yeah.
that, but so
Right.
and we're getting near the end of the time, but one of the things that we're going to talk about was your episode with Peter Reitzes. There were many, but there was one series that he had 4 years ago, I think, which was provocatively titled, Should Speech Pathologists Work with People Who Stutter? And, Peter, I think, made it pretty clear in there. I think he threw out the term 90 or the percentage of 95% was his guess as to the percentage of speech pathologists who probably should not work with folks who stutter. And you guys spoke a lot of the term generalist, right? Someone who doesn't have much experience with stuttering. Should they be working with folks who stutter? And I can tell you this is obviously this is anecdotal, my own experience in childhood. The speech therapists I saw, at least those that I can remember, I don't remember the ones I was seeing when I was 4 or 5 because I just don't remember that. But once I was old enough to know what was going on, the speech therapy I got as a kid made me actually feel worse about my stutter. Because you go in there and the adult, the specialist in this is saying, okay, I'm going to teach you this technique. All right. And it seems it was always some version of easy onset. Now I want you to go out in the world and use it. Go practice, go use it. And I'd go out and, practice and try to use it and it wouldn't work. And I'd be like, the professional is telling me this should work and it's not working. Again, I'm a loser. I can't do anything right on this, and so, and I don't think you guys said this in that episode. So this is me saying this, but I think that unless you have in my experience and from what I've heard from a lot of other folks who stutter, working with generalists who don't either have a lot of experience and knowledge of working with folks that stutter or who stutter themselves, which I think obviously is a massive insight into what the stuttering experience is. Just research it that you're not going to a generalist. And I think school. So I heard this. I don't know. Does this sound right? Someone said that 85% of the speech therapists in the state of Michigan are in the schools. Does that sound right?
I don't have any idea if that's true or not. I'm not sure.
Do you know nationally, like, if it's like, you have any idea what the percentage is of therapists?
I believe it was about half, I think. And again, that could be dated information, because my information generally, you're going back about 7 years, any data I have regarding like ASHA percentage as well. But I think the number that was typically bandied about was about half of the SLPs in the workforce were typically school-based, and the other 50% were in other settings. That may have shifted, but kind of a ballpark used to be about 50%.
I gotcha. And so is it safe to say that probably, well, the vast majority of speech therapists, period, are not specialists in stuttering, right? But you would assume that the vast majority of those in schools are not.
Yeah, well, see, my thing, and again, this and this could be a lengthy, we could do a whole hour on this by itself, and I'll try to get it shorter than that. But I mean, this goes way back. My concern about this goes way back. Again, when I first started in the profession, there was a requirement that you had to do 25 hours of fluency therapy in order to graduate and then to become certified. It was one of the requirements for a person to be a speech language pathologist. Then that began to change, and so they went to like hours in speech, hours in language, whatnot. Basically, during my career, the 40 some years I was a speech pathologist, and the 30 some years I was in higher ed, things began to get watered down. And part of that was because the scope of practice grew. So what happens is that SLPs have to do more and more as scope of practice grows. And the length of the master's program really didn't grow that much. And so you're trying to cram more and more into about the same amount of time. And one of the, for the last ASHA convention that I attended, I had submitted a proposal that was not accepted. The working title, I forgot what the working title was, but the sort of title I had in my mind was the insanity and dishonesty of the generalist SLP. And the notion there is that you think about what a student going through a typical graduate program in speech language pathology is going through. And also, like, for example, my students, during the semester they were taking my stuttering class, were also taking a course in swallowing. I think there was a language course, and I think maybe an aphasia course or a cognition course. So they had 3 other classes other than mine. It might have been the advanced audiology. I don't remember anyway. But they had 3 other classes plus mine. They were doing clinic. And so you're trying to present this sort of a coherent course that involves assignments and, readings and, a coherent view of the stuttering disorder. And you keep trying to harp on them. This might be the most important class you're going to take because you will get practice in these other disorder areas. You'll see lots of clients with swallowing problems, et cetera, but you're not going to see very many people stutter. So I think you should really understand you need to take this class seriously. But when you think about how students take in information in a class, you give them information, you're trying to be as coherent as you can be in your class. You're trying to make your lectures as understandable as possible. You're giving them PowerPoint notes, you're giving them resources, you're giving them readings. But they're just hearing snippets of what you're saying. Something sounds good to them, they write it down in their notes or whatever it might be. So by the time the semester's over, their mind is sort of all this, aphasia and swallowing and stuttering, and their goal is to get through the semester and get done and go home for the summer, or at least get to the summer classes or whatever. So and people say students retain like something like 10% of what you teach them anyway. So you're trying to give them a coherent view of stuttering, but they leave, they go out, they do an internship. They may or may not see kids who stutter when they're out doing their internships in the schools or the hospitals or whatever. To pretend that they're really ready to work with people who stutter in any meaningful way, the truth is that most of them aren't. Most of them are not. And what's probably even more of a problem nowadays is that what happens is that when people are looking for information to help them make decisions, they go to the internet. Okay, well, you do a search for stuttering on the internet. Well, you search for anything on the internet. Okay, but look for stuttering on the internet, stuttering therapy, whatever. Or you go to Pinterest or something like that. I don't know where they go to get their help, but there's a lot of misinformation on the internet about everything, but stuttering, since that's what we're talking about right now, there's a lot of misinformation about stuttering on the internet. So these well-intentioned individuals who have a little bit of information about stuttering that they learned from your class are now trying to figure out what they need to do. There are a lot of crackpots on the internet peddling stuff about stuttering that's just flat out wrong. There's some people who are trying to be helpful, who are peddling information that's probably somewhat correct, but not necessarily correct. On the internet, everybody is an expert. You can have a fancy looking website, even if the content is baloney, the website looks very authoritative. So here are these people trying to get information to help people who stutter, and they find something that looks good, and well, I'll just try this, you know. So you've got this kid who stutters, and here's this person trying to, you know, deliver therapy, and the therapy may or may not be good therapy, but the client doesn't know that, the parents don't know that, even the SLP may not really be sure whether what they're doing is really good or not. And it's not necessarily the fault of the SLP necessarily, but as I talked about near the end of my career, and as I talked about with Peter, I think we're getting to the point where, because of the way that education and speech language pathology is going, and the continued de-emphasis of stuttering by the American Speech Language Hearing Association, I think that at some point, I believe that some other association organization will step up and say, we need to find a way to verify that people providing services for people who stutter are qualified. Because I don't believe that ASHA necessarily is the best vehicle right now to determine whether the people that are providing the services are really qualified. And having the ASHA Cs does not by any means even come close to verifying that somebody is qualified to work with a person who stutters. And that personally to me is somewhat scary. I mean, I'd get these emails from students after they graduated. They kind of be 3, 4, 5 years after they graduated. And sometimes the emails would be very, very good. I've got this client, I've done this, and this, and I was wondering if I should try this, or I've got this client, this is what he's presenting, this is what I've tried to do. And you say, oh, good, this person listened to my class, they understood what I was talking about, they've gone back to their notes, and they're on the right path. I can give them a couple of suggestions, and they'll be going, you know, in the right direction. Others would contact me to say, I got this client, I went on the internet, I found this thing, and you'd be like, oh my gosh, you know, this was proceeding in my class, you know, and again, it's largely based on the individual that you're talking about. Not all students are the same. Some are more motivated than others. Some are more attentive than others. Some care more about the content than others. But I'm not sure. I think Peter may have been a little bit unkind saying 95% are not qualified, but I know that it's certainly well under half of the SLPs are qualified to work with people who stutter, and it's something that ASHA's not really do anything about. I mean, ASHA pretends to be turning out these highly qualified generalist SLPs, and generalist SLPs know a lot about a little bit. Then they become specialists. They go to a certain job site. They find themselves working largely with a certain circumscribed subset of clients. They become very competent in those areas that they sort of find themselves specializing in, either by choice or because that's what the work site dictates. But there are very, very few truly generalist SLPs. Most SLPs can't work with everybody because there's too much. The scope of practice is just too much. So
I can understand that. It's, you know, somewhat similar in dentistry. You know, I know it's a different profession, but you know, there's very few dentists out there that can do your braces and can do your implants and can extract your impacted wisdom teeth and your cosmetics and all that kind of stuff.
yes,
So,
right.
you know, and it's very important to know your limitations, I think, as a practitioner.
Right.
And I think it's so easy to get, well, I mean, I would imagine as a speech therapist, it's probably very easy to get lulled into the fact, well, my client who stutters, their stutters improved a lot when they're working with me, right? When we're in the clinic, I'm helping them, right?
Yeah.
I'm helping them.
Right.
But, and a lot of folks who stutter are a little hesitant to tell their therapist, sorry, what you're teaching me as soon as I leave this room isn't working at all.
Right. For sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Try to say that.
Yeah. Well, again, and as you experience and I experience, you think you're doing something wrong as the client because you're told, well, you do this, it'll work. It's working. Getting all this praise in the therapy room. Oh, you're doing a great job. Oh, you're using those tools. You're doing those techniques, and then you leave saying, well, I need to use my techniques. I better do it. And then you go out and it's not working. And it's like, well, I must be doing something wrong then. I need to practice harder. I need to try harder or whatever. And you may have had this experience as well. You then go home by yourself in your room and you're practicing your techniques in your room and they're working great in your room too. Like this is, hey, I got it. I got it figured out. And then you go out and again, it's like, well, damn, it's not working. I don't get it. I don't understand. So, but so much of that is understanding the entire disorder of stuttering. I mean, it's getting a handle on stuttering for the non-stutterer is not, it's not easy. It takes a lot of effort to truly be an empathetic SLP, to do what I call empathy-based practice is really difficult because understanding stuttering, from the perspective of the person who stutters, the loss of control, the being stuck, the social penalty, all that stuff, getting that is not, it's not easy. It's not something you just sort of pick up by listening to a couple of lectures in class, It involves a lot of sort of introspective, pondering about the nature of the disorder and maybe meeting people who stutter, working with a few, going to a few continuing education sorts of seminars and things like that. That's where you get that stuff. And it's asking a lot because, again, SLP's got to do it not just for stuttering, but for a whole bunch of other disorders as well. So it's a trap that ASHA has set for itself, and they've stepped right into it, but they don't acknowledge that this trap is got them by the ankle and they can't really get out of it. They just want to keep on struggling and think that they can deal with it. So I can say that now because I'm not an ASHA member anymore, so they can't like take away my membership or anything like that for saying these unkind things about ASHA. So I'm just a civilian. So.
Well, and I think I heard you say in the past that your guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, but your guess is that either that a divorce will come at some point. Either ASHA will divorce stuttering or stuttering will divorce ASHA.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And and it seems like, having folks who stutter intimately involved with whatever the help is for folks who stutter, and I think, maybe I'm a little bit biased on this because I now run a coaching program. I don't charge anybody for it, but a coaching program for folks who stutter. And, in my opinion, the combining the being with others who stutter, which is just in and of itself, for whatever reason, such a powerful thing, and sort of having people rowing in the same direction, so to speak, rather than sort of being on an island with them and their therapist, and then they barely interact with anybody else who stutters in the world, if anybody, and someone who stutters themselves, who has made some progress on their journey, however you define progress, whether it's, the below the iceberg stuff or the above the iceberg, or both. If one of my kids stuttered, for example, which they don't, but they're still young, so they could still start potentially, I would be much more comfortable having them with somebody that stutters themselves, whether they're an SLP or, like a solid mentor that you've researched that is good, as opposed to with with a generalist SLP. We are about to wrap up, but I asked you in advance if we could talk about this, because this is another episode that you did with Peter, and this won't be long, because as you mentioned there's a series, I think like 10 years ago, that Peter had done on Costal breathing, Costal, Costal. And he had yourself on one of those episodes. And from what I understand from the paper, it wasn't, well, you and Peter had written a paper on it at the time. It wasn't like a study. It was a paper on what you knew essentially about Costal breathing, right?
Right.
You had mentioned in that paper that to date, up until that time, there had never been a peer-reviewed published study that you knew of on Costal breathing. So no evidence for it, no evidence against it. It was sort of in a black box,
right.
So to speak. Is that still the case as far as you know? That
again, as far as I know, I mean, my thing is, and again, if you've been following Scott's stuttering therapy, he did a thing of a month or two ago, maybe longer than that, where he basically said that stuttering is not a breathing problem. I mean, that's what it boils down to. Is that I think that there's a lot of stuff about McGuire Costal breathing that goes way beyond breathing. I mean, there's a lot of team stuff. There's the openness about stuttering. There's a lot of stuff that's involved in. So to call it just a Costal breathing approach to treatment, it really is it's not a complete description of what the program entails. But again, my experience with stuttering has been that most people who stutter, who think they have breathing problems, the breathing problems are a reaction to stuttering. The breathing problems come about because the person who stutters, again, in an attempt to control their stuttering, to manage their stuttering, they start to change the way that they breathe, or they get stuck in a block. And so when your vocal folds lock and you can't get the word out, you feel like you're struggling with breathing. Well, you're not struggling with breathing per se. You're struggling because your vocal folds are locked and there's no place for the air to go. Again, my criticism of McGuire was more so the fact that these like deep breaths and things like that run counter to the way that the system is supposed to work for speech. You think about Costal breathing, for example, compared to Holland's easy onsets versus this. I can't remember what the term is that they use in Costal breathing. It's like what's the first syllable? What does the term? It's
so what I call it is assertive first sound.
Assertive first sound. So the idea is, like, on the one hand, you want to do an easy onset. So you want to be talking like this, and you want to be talking. And the idea is you want to let the system, do things in an easy way and not drive the system too hard, which really makes sense, because that's really, when you drive the system too hard, that's when things tend to lock up. I used to talk about it when I taught speech science, try to lift your car and phonate at the same time. The larynx is a pressure device. The larynx locks. When you drive the system too hard, the larynx as a reflex tends to want to lock. And so there are things about driving the system too hard, really, that actually run counter to what you really are trying to do when you're breathing for speech purposes. And what I was trying to talk about with Peter back in those days was not so much that there was anything wrong with that program or Costal breathing per se. It was more that when you analyzed what they were saying that they were doing, and you analyzed how the speech mechanism works or the breathing mechanism works for speech purposes, it didn't make sense that what they said was being accomplished could actually be accomplished and still be using the speech mechanism in the way that it was meant to be used for speech, or the breathing mechanism was meant to be used for speech. But I think that a lot of what makes that program successful is not the breathing per se. It's the team, the team aspect. It's the openness aspect. It's the support aspect. There's so many other things that go on in that that are not really teased out from the breathing exercises per se. And the challenge we run into with any approach like that has multiple components is that, well, which components are the ones that are contributing to the success that people are experiencing in that program? So I'm not anti Costal breathing. It's just that I don't logically, based on my experience, understand how a breathing program like that would necessarily lead to a change in fluency, when what I understand from the way it's being taught is it's sort of counterintuitive to the way that speech breathing should work. Now, let me also step back, and I should have said this at the beginning, not at the end. Maybe you can do a tape edit here, and you can move this to the beginning. I'm by no means an expert on Costal breathing. My beliefs, my thoughts, my perspectives are simply come about based on having done a little bit of reading about the program. I've never gone through the program myself. I've never experienced it firsthand, and so like many other things, I could be totally off the wall about this and be totally wrong. My issue is just simply that, again, I would agree with Scott that stuttering is not a breathing problem. So any sort of a breathing therapy to address stuttering is really not getting to stuttering. It's getting to something else. Again, I don't know if that really addresses what you want me to address or not.
No, that's good. And that's a good overview for sure of what yourself and Peter had spoken about. And first off, I'm certainly not, not speaking on behalf of McGuire. I did go through their training, but there were certain aspects of their technique that I took, that I've incorporated into my program. And the Costal breathing originally, from what I understand, came from a guy named Del Ferro, who was an opera singer in the Netherlands, who, the way the story goes, I haven't researched this independently to find out if it's true, but the way I heard it is apparently Del Ferro, who was not a person that stutters, was dating a girl or had a friend who stuttered and said, "Hey, it looks like you're sometimes out of breath." And their friend, the girlfriend, whoever it was, said, "Well, actually, I feel like I'm out of breath sometimes also." And the opera singer was like, "Well, there's a technique they taught us for, belting it out, belting out opera of really deep breathing. Want to try it?" And that person tried it, and apparently, supposedly there was some positive benefit. So he then started a program for people that stutter in the Netherlands, I think in the 1970s. And the way I understand it is McGuire then had done his course at some point, learned the Costal breathing, and then incorporated it. And then incorporated it into the program that McGuire started, which also has a good bit of sort of Joseph Sheehan, non-avoidance, face your fears, all that stuff. And so I am certainly not speaking on behalf of McGuire, but the Costal breathing, and I totally agree with you 100%, Bob, and this is true in anything in science, right? If you've got a bunch of different variables in the mix, like in this case, you got Costal breathing, you got the group effect, you got the voice projection thing, you got the deliberate disfluency, you got the support group, you got a bunch of different things in the mix, right? It's impossible to parse out what percentage of any success is due to what, right? And like you and Peter had said in the paper, you'd have to run an experiment where essentially, I think you said where you only do Costal breathing, let's say, nothing else, just Costal breathing, and you'll see what the effect is. And my take is that stuttering is a hard problem. So
right.
Throw in the whole kitchen sink at it, throw in some of this, if it works, and some of this and some of that is going to be more effective than any one, one technique, that sort of thing. But in short, there was one thing that you were and Peter, were not sure about, which is understandable because, how would you? I mean, this is not like peer reviewed or published anywhere, so how would you know this? There was a question over what exactly, like, how is Costal breathing really different than regular breathing, right? And I can, the fastest way to explain that, I think, is to show it. And again, I'm speaking for myself, and for my program, Stutter with Confidence, not McGuire, not Starfish, not Del Ferro, but when I was younger, I was trained on belly breathing also. I did a therapy as a teenager with belly breathing, and then at Hollins also they teach belly breathing there as well. And so I'm fairly skilled at belly breathing. So I'll just show you real quick the difference between the two. All right. So I'll start here with belly breathing, and notice that there's no movement up here when I belly breathe.
Yeah.
Right, there's only belly movement, there's no chest movement. Now I'll take a Costal breath. And I'm skinny, so you can actually see my ribs protruding through my shirt here.
Yeah.
So that is compared with, so that's, in short,
Right.
What the difference is. And obviously, the lungs sit right beneath the ribs, right? They're attached on the inside of the ribs there.
Right.
And as you had mentioned in that episode, the lungs aren't, it's not that we're sucking air in, it's that we're creating space, right? We're creating the vacuum, and then the air rushes in because of the pressure difference, I guess, right? And then when we exhale, we're not doing any, or you can do work to exhale if you blow it out like that. But typically, you don't have to do any work, right, in order to exhale. You just, the muscles are relaxing essentially, right, and the air is flowing out. And so those are, I think, two different ways of breathing. And I think, we certainly don't naturally, Costal breathe like that through the course of the day, right? We do that when we yawn, for example. I think right before you sneeze, I don't know if you ever noticed, right before you sneeze, you take a big breath, it's like, and then boom, you hit the sneeze. I think that's probably a Costal breath. Sometimes you'll see athletes like LeBron James, when it's a frenzied period, when they're sprinting back and forth, you'll see the chest rising and falling. So that's, my understanding of it. And for me, I was trained on the belly breathing multiple, times, multiple ways. I never got much out of that. Like much help with my stutter out of that at all. It did have some relaxation effects, which is a good thing, I think, but certainly not like, how do I control this stuttering moment? And I am by no means saying there's any one technique in the world that'll work for everybody. And again, I think how you feel about your stuttering, the foundation of the iceberg, is very important. But the way so to follow through with this, this approach, at least, the way that I teach it is, and for me, Bob, I had never conceived of stuttering as a problem of holding back. That thought had never crossed my brainwaves because I was always so confused. Why can I speak just fine when there's nobody there? But you put people in the room and all of a sudden, there it is. Why? What the hell is going on? And I would say almost all of us folks that stutter have probably asked ourselves that question at some point or another, right? And it never made any sense to me until I thought about it. Well, maybe this is just me holding back for whatever reason, whether it's a genetic thing, or whether it's my habits, or whether it's my trying not to stutter, whatever it is. I haven't lost the ability to say my name, right? I still know how to say my name, but for many of us, it's one of the most challenging things to say. It's like, why? It's, my lungs aren't damaged, like you said, lungs are healthy, vocal folds are healthy, articulators move. Why suddenly does my speech mechanism abandon me when I most want it to be there for me, right? Whether you're giving the presentation or you're, at the job interview or whatever. Why is that? And John Harrison, John Harrison?
Oh, John, yeah.
He's big on this, right? He's got an exercise where he says, read a book on stuttering and take 2 pages, and everywhere where you see the word stuttering, cross it out and write holding back. Now, look, I'm not saying that those 2 words is everything one needs to know about stuttering. Obviously, it's very complicated. But for me, that was sort of a revelation to think of it in those terms. And then from a physical standpoint was to try to put myself in a position where I am less likely to hold it back. And so the voice projection, and this, you mentioned at IU that maybe the most useful thing that approached technique that you did was learning how to pause, right? And learning how to, probably get a little more dialed in to your cadence and to formulating, I would think, right? And sort of public speaking 101 stuff, right? I mean, almost all great public speakers really know how to use a pause, right? They get you leaning in for effect, and I think, and I've heard Peter mention this on his show also, that for him in his experience, learning to pause, is a fairly effective thing to do. And so voice projection is also something that sort of a public speaking 101 thing, right? If the crowd can't hear you, then you're not communicating to them at all, right? They have to hear you. And, and in a lot of situations in life, it's loud. It might be a party, or you might be talking about somebody on the phone and there's background noise for them. So there is value just in a communication standpoint of projecting our voice.
Sure.
And so in keeping with that idea of holding back, and there's a sport in the Netherlands that I heard about. I've never played it, but apparently you have to jump across a wide ditch. And it's too wide for you just to jump across, naturally. So you have a pole, and you run and you stick the pole, and then the momentum will carry you across the ditch if you do it right, I guess. If you hold back in that sport, from what I understand, and it makes sense, guess what's going to happen? You're going to end up in the ditch, right? You got to commit. You got to go. You got to go assertively. You got to go hard. And this is sports in general. You think about American football, right? If you hold back in American football, you're going to get hurt, right? You're going to get hurt. You might get hurt anyway, but you're really going to get hurt if you hold back. And so for me, that analogy, well, with my own speech, learning to project my voice, and the speaking at the top of the breath. So with pressure, right? When we exhale, the air comes out because there's a pressure gradient, right? We've built up the pressure a lot in our lung. When your lungs are full, what does the air naturally want to do? It wants to come out.
But see, again, when you're speech breathing, the lungs aren't full. I mean, that's the whole idea. We only use a very small portion of our lung volume when we're speaking. It's just a small portion. So
when non-stutterers speak, they don't have to fill their lung. They don't fill their lungs up. Right. In order to speak, unless I've noticed, if you ask someone a loaded question, like let's say someone with a complicated relationship, and hey, how's the relationship going? They're like, well, let me tell you, Mike. They'll take a huge breath right before they start speaking, right? Because they have a mouthful to say, and they're naturally just like, okay, I need a lot of air for this one. They're not thinking about that. They just do it.
And again, people do know how much air they're going to need for the task at hand, but rarely do we fill our lungs or get even close to having our lungs full when we're and I think that's part of the misunderstanding, is that people don't understand how speech breathing works. And so what happens is that they develop these ways of thinking about breathing that don't have a basis in reality of how the mechanism is meant to work. And as a result, then you can have all these techniques that you want, and the techniques might in some way be helpful, but they're not helpful in the sense that they're making you use your breathing mechanism any better for the purposes of speech. They're just, again, whether it's a distraction or whatever it might be, I'm not sure, but we typically just use belly breathing when we're speaking. We don't need deep breaths when we're speaking. We don't use a lot of costal breaths when we're speaking. And so again, I'm not trying to derail your train here. I'm just saying that many things that you're talking about are not necessarily aligned with the way that the body works for the purposes of speaking. And so I'm not trying to mess you up here. I'm sorry if I'm doing that, but
no, you're not. It's an open and honest conversation. Good stuff. And I don't dispute for a second that you're right about that. And that's not how that's not how natural speech normally happens. But for me, for whatever reason, whether it was genetics or, the iceberg from childhood, or just whatever it was, I would hold back what I was saying. And so for me, when the stuttering wolf, as I like to call the opponent in this sport of speaking, shows up and whispers in my ear, Mike, you're about to not be able to say this word. And for me, that was almost always a self-fulfilling prophecy in the past. When I thought to myself, I'm about to not be able to say it, sure enough.
Sure.
Right. And so I needed to do something different in that, if I wanted to not, let the wolf sort of get me, and again, it was key for me that I didn't give a, what, if I had a block. I didn't like it, but I was going to say it anyway. I wasn't going to run away. That really helped because I'm not afraid of losing control. If I start stuttering a lot, my next sentence, well, I've faced tens of thousands of those blocks. I know I'll be fine. I'll be a little tired because it's tiring to push through blocks. But, and I started noticing that as I got into my late 30s, that I was actually physically tired after a 20-minute I was more tired from a conversation than I was from playing full court basketball, which isn't how it's supposed to be, so for me, it's about sort of teeing it up so that it's hard to hold it back. And so essentially it's a release. Well, I think one of the most relaxing things that people do is that not pushing air out, but just that relaxation of a release, right? Sort of like a sigh almost, right? That
yoga breath, yeah.
Decompression, if you will, right? And so release the air, get the big breath. And the analogy would be with blowing a balloon up, right? You blow a balloon up real full of air. If you don't tie it off, what does that air do when you let it go, right? The air wants to force its way out and the balloon flies around the room, of course. Our lungs are, I think fairly similar. You
Right.
fill them up with air, and it's
Yeah.
almost hard to hold your breath at the top of a full breath. It's really
It is.
uncomfortable, right?
It
The
is.
pressure,
Yes, right,
the air wants to flow out.
right.
And then the voice projection, and it's something that John Harrison talks a lot about. He's big on doubling your volume. So in other words, do the opposite of holding it back. And in my mind, and as a look, I'm not, I'm not, trying to universalize anything. And I realize that there needs to be, in this world, there needs to be evidence and proof. I get that. I fully respect that. And right now we don't have that, right? We don't have proof for or against, this approach. And as you mentioned, it's only one aspect of the approach. There's all these other things rolled in there. But the way I think about voice projection, which you could also call assertive first sound, like start at your full volume, is that it's the opposite of easy onset. It's the polar opposite of easing our way into the word. It's not Mike Wilson, where I barely articulate my M and I ease my way into the pool. I'm diving into the pool, right? Mike Wilson. Not that we're yelling at people, but Mike Wilson.
Right.
So in other words, making it crystal clear between my mind, my brain, and my speech mechanism, we're hitting this. We're moving forward. We're jumping across the ditch. We're going hard, no hesitation, go hard. And and doing it right at the top of the big breath, where it's actually hard to hold back our air, right? Like that's uncomfortable to hold our breath at the top of a thing. So Mike Wilson. And so basically that's what I've habituated now. And when the wolf shows up, so let's say I'm talking and wolf shows up, I release my air, then get that big breath and hit it assertively at the top. And if there's any problem, I release it. So in other words, if it's Mike Wilson, nice to meet you. So in other words, rather than trying to struggle my way through the block, and it's not a pull out, and I'm not criticizing any technique. I was trained on the pull out as well, which would be Mike Wilson, right? That sort of thing. But that for me, for whatever reason, I never had any luck with going from tension to all of a sudden intense relaxation where the word just flows, right? I need to hit, in my case, I need to hit the reset button. So Mike Wilson, nice to meet you. And I found that resisting time pressure, if you will, not feeling like, got to get this word out now. It's weird. Get it out, spit it out, Wilson, spit it out. That sort of patience with myself to release it, then take the breath, then speak. If I have another problem, no worries, release it again. With eye contact. And if there's any confusion, anything, to say, hey, I have a stutter. That's what you're seeing there. Okay, that's fine, right? And then move on. So in other words, combining that radical honesty, as I like to call it, just proclaim it from the rooftops. If anybody's confused, hey, I got a stutter, and even talk about sometimes the stuttering journey. I've found to be useful because people find it interesting usually. Okay, that's good, because they don't know anything. Most people know nothing about stuttering, other than when they stutter, or maybe one or two people in the movies, yeah. And then the support, then the being with others that stutter, the having a practice network. One of the challenges I think with speech therapy is you get your 1 hour a week, maybe your 2 hours a week, and then the rest of the time, you're kind of on your own.
Right.
But if you can have on demand, and that's, the way we do it on my coaching program, we do daily warm-up calls with each other. We're in a WhatsApp group. So if anybody, has a wants a warm-up for whatever reason, they can post in the group, hey, anybody up for a chat? 4 out of 5 times, somebody will call you, because none of us are cured. So we all need to practice. So nobody's wasting anybody's time, right? Everybody needs to practice. And in speech therapy, that's just not practical for the speech therapist to be on call for your practice sessions every day, right? That's just not how it
Right.
works. They can't be on call for all their clients. You know, it's just not realistic. So in a way, it's very self-sustaining, right? Because everybody's, you know, nobody's cured. You know, if indeed you want to get more skilled at a particular technique, whatever that technique may be, well, just like getting good at a musical instrument or a sport or whatever, you got to practice. You know, that's common sense, right? And so it's very self-sustaining when people can just call each other on demand and practice. And you're also getting that support. You're remembering that you're not alone, that you're totally not alone on the journey. So that's the long version, Bob. I know I've had you on here for almost 2 hours, man. It's a great chat.
Time flies.
Apologize about that. But are there any thoughts in relation to what I just said, or any?
No, as I say, I think, but again, I think when you're talking about that, you're talking about there's a lot of stuff going on there. That's all I'll say. And so I think that, let's just say there's more than just breathing that's going on there. And I still think that what you're doing would be counter to what the most efficient use of your breathing mechanism should be. But my feeling about anything is that if it works for you, that's the important thing. Because my whole thing about therapy during most of my career was that what you do with clients is you work with them to find out what they want, what they need, what works for them. There's a lot of exploring, there's a lot of experimentation. And if somebody hits on something that works for them, unless it's totally like off the wall, you say, you know what, this is going to work for you for a couple of weeks, but the wheels are going to fall off. You say, hey, if it's working, this is great, you know, do it. And that's the way that it sounds to me. If I sat here with you and said, well, physiologically speaking, you know, what you're telling me, it's like, no, that's not productive. I think you found something that works for you. Use it.
I hear you.
Go with it.
Oh, well said. And I agree with you that if you just did this Costal breathing alone without the rest of it,
right,
you know, it's, you know, I don't know where it would be, but it'd be a lot, you know, a lot less effective, I think. And what we do on our phase 1 is what Dr. Ham had done for me when I was 18 at Florida State, where we meet up over Zoom and we go out for 3 sessions with no technique whatsoever. In fact, I tell them in phase 1, well, and first off, Bob, as a side note, I'm very clear with everybody that I'm a dentist, not a speech therapist. This is not speech therapy, right?
Okay.
Not speech therapy. It's coaching and mentorship. But what we do in phase 1, well, and as I tell people, if anything in phase 1, I want you stuttering more, not less, so that we have to face the full-on stutter. We need to realize even the worst, you know, the worst, quote unquote, that the stutter has to throw at us, which is out there talking to strangers. You know, that's what we do. We meet up over Zoom on our phone out there in the mall. We speak to strangers. I put people in the breakout rooms of 2. You know, you talk to somebody where you are, and I talk to somebody where I am. You talk to, and we use our most challenging words. So if Mike is a feared word, I'll ask people, where's Mike's shoes, for example? And they'll say, where? So I have to say it again, right? And we practice eye contact, you know, rather than looking away. Nope. Nope. Mike Wilson, you know, whatever we're saying, and get used to that reaction. So essentially phase 1 is all about sort of like facing the worst of the enemy fire, so to speak, and realizing that you're still standing, that you're not in jail, right, you're not bleeding, you're not dead, you're still alive. You know, it's not the end of civilization, and that most people are going to be cool. Most people are not Kevin on the playground when I was 11. They're really not, you know? And then once people are sort of steeled up, you know, and it's amazing. I had one fella say in the text group after one of those sessions, he said, I never knew that people would sit there and listen to me when I stuttered. He said they treated me as an equal person, as if I was one of them, was his quote, right? In other words, he's been walking around the first 34 years of his life feeling like he's literally a second-class citizen so long as he stuttered. And then he realized pretty quickly, wait a second, have I been telling myself the wrong story about, sort of what the world thinks about my stutter all along? And so then in phase 2, after they've gone through phase 1, and 1/3 of people just don't show up for phase 1. They say they want to do it. I explain it all to them, but they don't show up because, I'm asking them to go out and speak to other human beings and stutter, right? But those who show up and do the 3 sessions, then move on to phase 2. And phase 2 is where we do an intensive 33 hours in 3 days, so it's 11 hours a day. We learn the breathing and the voice projection. And then near the end of phase 2, we bring it back out there. And it also includes deliberate disfluencies. So for example, like I'm stretching some sounds out right now, or starting some words and then pausing, really marinating in the pause, learning to formulate before we open our mouth. And I'm it's all driving towards getting to a spontaneous point. That's certainly the goal, but whenever we're learning to do something in a different way, we have to do it a little bit consciously at first, if you know what I'm saying. So that's a rough overview, but it's been a huge pleasure speaking with you, Bob, and I appreciate you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
Likewise, Bob. Thank you, and have a good day, my friend.
Okay, thanks very much.